psychology of this and the interaction with the problem of evil, because they are very, very they're close. They're very tightly bound up with each other. Alvin Plantinga, I think in the early 70s, when he was starting to really get, I think he published first in 1958, but by the early 1970s he was really getting a reputation as one of the foremost analytic philosophers who was rehabilitating Christian philosophy and getting back up to sort of the standard where it was academically respectable, because it had fallen a bit into disrepute and lack of, because with the rise, with the emergence of the fundamentalist movement, particularly in, say, the early decades, first 2 decades of the 20th century, in a sense they found that there was quite a dramatic withdrawal of people who wanted to be faithful to the Christian worldview. They withdrew. Quite a lot of those people became very obscurantists and very anti-intellectual. That's not universal. That's Dr. Machen, who founded like a shadow faculty to Princeton, which eventually went on to become Westminster Seminary. He still had a very holistic view of the importance of engaging in the intellectual realm, but fundamentalism, that fundamental impulse to withdraw from society and to be aggressive in your evangelism and to say that culture is apostate, that was very, very detrimental to the quality of, say, Christian thought, for people actually trying to, if they were Christians, it was something that was almost never talked about in their philosophy. You wouldn't have known that they were Christian thinkers. What Alvin Plantinga is credited with doing is creating like a whole new movement and generation of analytic, and not necessarily just even analytic, just Christian philosophers. I think there's thousands of people within the Christian philosophy movement who members of the Christian philosophy sort of society now. I'm not even sure. I'm not sure if he was responsible for founding it, but there was certainly lots of people attempting to do philosophy within the different Christian traditions. And so, one of the things he wrote in the early 1970s, he's credited in many ways with answering one of the great problems of philosophy, which is the problem of evil. When I say answering, I mean there's a very famous atheist during the late 1940s, early 50s, and in fact, he was one of the great sort of post-positivists. So he wasn't a logical positivist, but he was one of the first sort of like post-positivists. I suppose you would say naturalist, who wanted to talk about theological problems and the problems of God. He was an atheist, and he was a strong atheist. He was very well known as an atheist, but he wasn't saying the logical positivist approach to religion. Because the logical positive approach to religion, sorry, I get a bit hoarse here, the logical positivists had what was called the principle of verification. So that basically meant that something would be considered meaningful if it was analytical, tautological. So you would say like a bachelor. A bachelor is an unmarried male, and that's like what's called an analytic statement, because you're not getting any more information, because when you say a bachelor, that means, and that is the definition. By definition, a bachelor is an unmarried male. So the statement a bachelor is an unmarried male doesn't give you any more information about the real world, or it's defined irrespective of matters of fact. That's the posh way. Or you would say Kant had the definition, the predicate is included in the subject, which is I think some modern philosophers get a bit upset with but that's still good. It's still a good working definition of. It's just an older definition, really. And so they had they would say something was meaningful if it was an analytic. So in a sense, you could have sort of like lots of mathematical definitions and logical. That's why they're called logical positivists, in a sense, because you could admit logic and logical deductions. But they said that something else was meaningful if it could be verified in the real physical world. So if it was, say, like a statement like the moon is made of green cheese, you would say, well, is that verifiable in principle? Might be difficult to do in practice, but is it verifiable in principle? And you say yes. Well, that's a meaningful statement then. But if you had a statement that say that that God is good or God is corporeal, you'd say, well, how would you verify that? They say, no, you can't verify. Therefore, it's a meaningless statement. So they were actually very radical in their metaphysics, and they actually said, well, all statements regarding God or regarding anything metaphysical, like trying to define, for example, what's real, or trying to conceptualize what's real, they're all considered meaningless statements. So it was a very, very radical sort of point of view, but it was incredibly sort of influential as a viewpoint. So if you were trying to have a debate, this happened, I think, in C.S. Lewis founded what was called the Socratic Society in, I think he was at Oxford, wasn't he, or was it Cambridge? I think he's Oxford, wasn't he? He was Oxford. And some of the greatest debates of that era, were hosted within the Socratic Society. Lots of philosophers, C.S. Lewis is a much misunderstood figure. He wasn't just he was one of the finest sort of English literary figures. He taught, I think, English literature. He's one of the technically he was remarkable in that. But he's much less well known for his willingness to engage with his philosophical peers. There's a very famous and very misrepresented and misunderstood debate that he had with Anne Winscombe and name's just gone out of my head there. But it's a very famous debate where they said that she so decimated him because he was talking about it's the argument for miracles, and apparently she's a very famous, she very well known, very well recognised, very well considered as a philosopher, and she so decimated them that he slumped away to his quarters in Oxford, never to emerge again, except he was writing children's books. People actually represented the debate like that. But of course, when you read her account of it, she said no. In fact, his response to this initial, because she gave him a very rigorous critique of his view, and he went away and he came back with a revised argument, and she complimented him on his revised argument. And I think there is a guy called Repair, who I think he wrote the one C.S. Lewis's Dangerous Ideas. If you've seen that sort of popular philosophical series, it takes different people's ideas. There's one called Darwin's Dangerous Ideas, and so it's just a series. It's an edited sort of series, and he concentrates on that argument, and in a sense tries to develop it, strengthen it, modernise it. But she was very complimentary of his, and she says some of the things which some of those issues, some of those things which we read, we await an answer, because there wasn't. He was very interested, sort of like in the importance of philosophy and thinking, and at this time, when they would have a debate and logical positivism was so strong during that era, and the logical positivists would always basically say, well, religious language is meaningless, therefore that's the end of the argument. So there was no discussion. And so Flew was somebody who was one of the first to take it beyond that and say, no, religious language, it does express meaningful there, and it does have cognitive content. That was another thing that logical positives were famous for. They were saying that anything that has any sort of metaphysical flavour, or is talking about religion, or the softer logical positivists would say, okay, yes, it does have some meaning, but it's emotive meaning, it's not cognitive meaning, it's not principles that you can, it's just purely subjective, and it makes you feel a particular way, it's expressing something about how you feel, but there's nothing in the world, there's no physical analogue, you can't connect it on to the world. And whereas Flew was one of the first to go into religious discourse, he was an atheist, and he was a very famous atheist, and he's a very sharp guy, but one of his strongest objections, he had a couple of very good sort of like analogies of the gardener who you came across. There was two people walking on. They come across this garden, and in the middle of the forest, and it looks like it's been tended, and so they said, oh, there must be a garden here, he said, well, they look and they sort of don't see the garden. But the person said, no, definitely a gardener, but we don't know. He obviously can't be a physical gardener. He must be, it must be invisible. He must be invisible to our eyes. And he was basically saying that's a bit like how in medieval philosophy it was very much called the god of the gaps, and he was saying that you end up chopping things off. People just end up chopping all the bits off as they start to be able to explain things, or if they're just pre-committed to a medical physical view, they'll just reinterpret and redo their commitments and just change their interpretation, so the content gets less and less and less and less until eventually you've got a completely contentless statement that's supposed to be something about God. And so he was very famous for sort of being able to pull apart those type of arguments. And he, in many ways, he changed the way people looked at that issue. And in many ways, he sort of like he dominated that sort of thought. He dominated until Plantinga sort of like came at that sort of. He dominated that idea of evil. And the classical statement of evil. Sorry, I'm bouncing about a little bit here, but this is. I think this is useful just to hear this, because there's so many different little bits of this connected here. And I'm sure I'll revisit these at some points, but I think it's really useful just to get a bit of an idea of the vista of how this interacts during this period, because there's been some big fundamental changes in the way this argument was dealt with, especially the argument from evil, which I think is one of the most significant in discourse, and when you're talking to people and they've got a visceral reaction against you when, say, you try and share something about your faith. They'll often say something like, well, my gran was a really good person and she died really painfully of cancer, and I can't believe in that God. I have no way I'm going to believe in a God who allowed her to suffer like that or something. And a bit like this one of the. It's just a very common sentiment. I think Ted Turner, who was he's one of the big media moguls. I don't even know if he's alive. I think he probably might even be alive. But he used to, he's multi-billionaire. One of the things he sort of like said, he said, oh, I don't know if there's a heaven, but if there is, the only thing that it's good for is to dump our toxic waste there. And apparently, when he was younger, when he was growing up, he prayed for his mum or his gran or some very close relative to be healed God, will you please heal them if you're real? And they didn't, and they died a very painful, slow death from cancer. And so it's an argument to do with free will, to do with our response, to do with the place of evil. This sort of this interaction of those three distinct things, which really has enormous cultural significance as well as philosophical significance, and it's one of these real live, fertile, I suppose, almost like an electric sort of issues, which really provokes very, very strong reactions in people. So it is really important to get some sort of handle and some sort of introduction to this. I'm not going into it, you could spend hours and hours and hours and hours and hours on this, and I'm just trying to introduce it, trying to provoke things. But one of the things that Plantinga did, which is what was the point I was making starting 10 minutes ago, was in the early 1970s, when his reputation was really starting to get going. He wrote a book called God, Freedom and Evil, which is actually a basic collection of different sort of like essays, but they're sort of like joined together. He's threaded them together, and that was considered one of the real progressions in this sort of like argument, that the classical statement of the argument from evil is like this. So it's a bit like saying that Hume writes this. Hume was famous for people very much present him as an atheist. Whether he was, he's very famous for his attacks on natural theology and that. Was he completely an atheist? Well, he always maintained a very critical view of religion. He was brought up, interestingly, within the Puritan tradition, rejected it when he was about 17. But he always, like people say, when they study Hume and his strange relationship with religion, he maintained an interaction with it, which was very... people often sort of like put on the philosophical goggles that they want to about people when they look down. They'll look at Descartes, and they'll say, well, Descartes was just watching his own back. He was probably really an atheist, but he knew he didn't want to suffer the same fate as Galileo, and therefore he used lots of religious language, and he was very, very skilled as a literary. But he wanted to sort of try and be a faithful Roman Catholic. He wanted to remain that. I mean, now he did move to Holland, a Protestant place, to get away from what was going on in France, where he obviously had strong element of self-preservation and self-interest to divorce himself from what was going on because of all the papal attacks on what was considered heretical positions. So people do, when they're dealing with this issue, they do. There's a real. It's very in sort of inflammatory. It can be very, very inflammatory. So, Plantinga was one of the first to really move the argument on. So, but Hume, when he talked about the argument, he basically said Epicurus' question is unanswered still. If God is, I'm sort of doing a very poor paraphrase here, but he said, if God is all-powerful, omnipotent, posh theological word, omnipotent, if God is omnipotent, and if God is good, then if that is the case, then if God does not want evil in the world, then God would use his power to deal with evil, the problem of evil. So the fact that there's still evil in the world either tells us that God is not omnipotent. So in a sense, if you then have the view that only an omnipotent being is worthy of our worship and being placed in an honour and worthy of us in a sense, being less than human, less than men. Hemingway, the famous British poet, said that if a man gets down on his knees and prays, he's finished. Which you can obviously, if a man ever gets to that point where he gets down on his knees, and prays, he's finished. So you're saying, so in a sense, if only the omnipotent being is worthy of our worship, which you can argue about that, but you see the point. Even if you don't accept it, you can still see the point. But he was saying that, so the presence of evil in the world is considered to be incompatible with God being both good. So it's like he said that if God does not, if God is omnipotent, but he allows evil in the world, then Hume came from Epicurus, but Hume requoted him and said that means that God must be malevolent. He must enjoy the infliction of pain and people suffering. So the great logical problem always was that was considered incompatible, that God's goodness and God's omnipotence and the presence of evil in the world they were considered to be incompatible. And that's like the classical problem of evil, because it goes all the way back to ancient Greece, recapitulated in the Renaissance, found in the work of Hume. And so it's always been a very, very issue which is people get incredibly focused and passionate about it. And Plantinga was one of the first to in a sense progress that argument. I'll put the little books. It's a relatively easy book to read, and it's astonishingly accessible, and it's a real contribution to the debate.